Ever wondered how folks survived the Great Depression? Most states squeezed every last bit out of their environment, whipping up surprisingly practical dishes. But practical doesn't mean dull. Each state crafted some downright legendary meals that I'll reveal today. In Alabama, what was native to people were things like black-eyed and field peas, which provided a lot of steady protein to the locale there for barely any money. That was the kind of food that kept people going back then, because you essentially wanted to maximize your value for money. Every cent counted more than ever before, and it was a rough time that led to a lot of people completely reworking their diets and eating habits to keep up with the times. Usually these peas would be mixed with molasses or syrup and enjoyed in do-it-yourself soups that would kind of work, but they wouldn't really taste good. Then again, as long as it was nutritious and cheap, no one could complain. Alaska, on the other hand, was luckier. They had the privilege of being next to bodies of water, so they could actually catch their food hunter-gatherer style and essentially eat for free. Subsistence living became the normal lifestyle that people incorporated into their weekly routines, and one of the best ways to sustain an entire family and take advantage of the bounty of nature was fish and game stews. Any kind of stew would work. It wouldn't really be a proper recipe, and a lot of the time it would just be using whatever hands-on ingredients they could come up with. But hey, it filled everyone's bowl. People living in Arizona were pretty much eating very similarly to how people in Alabama were living. They had beans instead of peas and chili instead of molasses. But chili beans were something that people would eat even in regular times when the economy hadn't caved in on itself. So in that regard, they got off pretty lucky. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but I'm really not kidding. It was a luxury to even have food, but to be able to enjoy it too made you one of the really lucky ones during the Depression. Chili beans, thanks to Mexican influences, let locals live another day. One of the things you'll often hear your grandparents repeating like a broken record or a parrot is the importance of corn in your diet and how you really need to eat your greens and your corn. Well, it's not for nothing. Cut them some slack and just lend an ear the next time you hear it, because in Arkansas, and in a majority of other states too, fried cornbread and greens were the daily lunch and breakfast of many families. Cornbread in general was ridiculously cheap and easy to get, and it was common for people to barter with it or for it too, so it definitely got a lot of mileage in Arkansas, thanks to them always having a knack for growing corn. California also had the benefit of having some good and fertile soil, which is what helped it last out the economic drought with relatively everything still as it was, besides the obvious damages that everyone suffered. Some states were hit a lot worse than others, but California had government surpluses going for it and a rich history of agricultural practices, so they always had greens like cabbage and lettuces in plenty. Cabbage soup was a pretty popular pick there, especially if they had any kind of cheap bread to go with it. Cornbread was also used as a substitute for the typical ingredients you would use for a pancake, and speaking of vegetables, one of the most reliable ones in the Depression for the country as a whole were potatoes. You can kind of see where I'm going with this, can't you? You've probably been around the block with potato pancakes more than a few times in your lifetime, but unless you're from Colorado, you wouldn't know about how the state has a natural tendency for potato farming. That's why any kind of dish that was made out of them was widely popular there, but especially pancakes, because it restored some sense of normalcy in a time that was drastically changing day by day. Connecticut was also one of those places that happened to be lucky because of where it was. It's in times like this you learn the importance of territorial advantages, kids. For Connecticut, its plus point was being right next to the coast, which meant that they would always have a steady supply of clams and fish. Clam chowder was something that people there were already used to eating, especially most of the labor force, which were fishermen, so it wasn't too much of a change for them. But what was a pretty jarring thing to adapt to was how little they could get for those same clams and fish now compared to like a year ago. Delaware also had to make do with what scraps it could get. People from there were passing day by day on peas and soups, so the two would eventually cross over. It was natural for pea soup to become as common as it did in Delaware. It was a way to keep hydrated, get protein, and get some carbs too, depending on the kind of peas that were available. Making soups out of anything you could was kind of just the thing to do back then. It was a really common practice that a lot of Americans started adopting because of how convenient and easy to make they were. Southern states like Florida thrived off of everyday staples like grits, cornbread, and fish, since it was also one of the coastal states that relied on fishing to get their money. It was a skill that really came in handy during the Depression, knowing how to fish, probably more than it had ever mattered before those times had come knocking. People went from eating deli meats and foods, wraps and bacon every day to making do with grits and fish, which was a lucky day for most in Florida as far as they were concerned. Georgia had Hoppin' Johns, which was a piece of culture that was taken from the Gullah people, an African-American tribe that had a long-established presence in the state. Their cooking methods relied a lot on natural, organic food. Fruits, peas, beans, stuff like that. That's why there was such an interest from the broader community into how they cooked things, because they wanted to know how to make the best use of ingredients like that too. Luckily, the Hoppin' John recipe spread enough that it became a household name. It was really just rice and peas, but it was homely and cozy, feelings that you just could not get during the Depression. Hawaiians were struck very hard by the Depression. A lot of families couldn't begin to cope with the bills and the increase in costs on top of the lack of business. They had one advantage, if you could call it that, which was that they knew how to make the best use out of local ingredients. That's why they would stick to things like spam musubi, which just involves seaweed, rice, and grilled spam. Maybe that might sound relatively fancy to you compared to the rest, but they even used to feed this same stuff to US soldiers because of how practical it was. People that were in Idaho probably found themselves relating to Southern tastes more often, since they only had things like potato soup to keep the hunger at bay with. The soup was also pretty bare bones. It wasn't anything you'd really think to call a soup in normal times. Just some water, onions, potatoes, and if they were lucky, a bit of milk. If there's one thing you can take away that isn't completely bleak, it's that all the different states exploring potato dishes really helped give them a rise in popularity when the economy would settle. In Illinois, they used to have a pretty cheeky acronym for something that's actually pretty good as far as taste goes. They used to think chipped beef on toast looked like poop on toast because it would look like somebody had just done their business on your toast instead of the bathroom. But regardless, don't let that fool you. A lot of people found a lot of comfort in this simple dish that involved canned or dried beef and simple toast. Indiana managed to keep things cost-effective and healthy with a meal that really managed to come in clutch for a lot of households, like dandelion salad. The best part was that they didn't need to buy or trade for the dandelions. They could rely on the ones that grew all around them and forage instead. Unfortunately, in practice, that didn't pan out as well as we'd hope. With so many people in the state foraging all of a sudden, there was an overall shortage of the flowers. That kind of led to them increasing in value too, all because you could make a nifty and nutritious salad out of them. I really can't stress enough how popular cornmeal was. Even in places like Iowa, where, mind you, corn was never really public friend number one, cornmeal mush started to be widely consumed. People started to eat it because of the simple taste, and the fact that it was so inexpensive that even in these times you could afford it. Plus, America would go towards this later, but this little stretch of time was probably one of the driving factors behind the rise of convenience food because, as you'll see, most of these dishes are pretty much based around how easy they are to make. Kansas has always been a really big fan of their chicken, but that became really hard to come by once the Depression hit. Most kinds of meat became inaccessible to people, and that's why they started eating stuff like squirrels and weeds. However, Kansas still managed to be a state where you could technically get chicken some of the time. It wasn't really that grand or put together, but you could still get basic dishes like steamed chicken, and it really counted back then. That's why they would add stuff like homemade noodles to really stretch the chicken and make it more of a comfort meal. In Kentucky, they had burgoo, which you may not have heard of in our time because the dish has pretty much faded away into the annals of history. Still, there's a lot worth mentioning here. See, with this dish, it was really easy to just use whatever you had on hand and get cooking. That was the beauty of burgoo, that it was a stew made entirely out of the ingredients available in the moment. That could be anything, from chicken and vegetables to actual seasonings and different flavors. Sometimes it was a treat, sometimes it was a pretty basic stew, but it could fill the family most days. People in Louisiana also sustained themselves via stuff like rice and red beans, which were extremely inexpensive as a dish. They would use dried beans like pinto or kidney ones and simply eat them together with plain rice. If they were particularly blessed that week, the average middle class or working family would put in some sausages and spices, but it was just a source of protein when it was really hard to come by. Red beans also have more value than just being a good source of protein, so the locals of the state stuck by this recipe. In Maine, they used to have lobster. I know that sounds pretty rare and out of place for a time called the Great Depression, but hear me out. America wasn't always a land where you had to pay a chunk of your paycheck for a good lobster. In this time period, it used to be known as poor man's food because of how readily available lobsters were when fishing. It was made with milk or even cream, and a lot of coastal communities lived off of catching as much lobster as they could. Maryland also had it lucky in this regard. It got away with having oyster stew more often than not, and that beats out potato soup in my opinion. I mean, at least in the flavor department, you know? It's got a lot more going on. The thing is, people really started to rely on all kinds of sources of seafood and protein that they could scavenge and catch on their own, which is why you'll see a big rise in recipes like this that can feed entire families and need ingredients like oysters, which you could catch pretty easily in Maryland. In Massachusetts, they used to have a type of bread that no one would recognize anymore, but was a die-hard favorite for the people there. It was known as Boston brown bread, and no, I don't know why Boston is in the name. However, what I do know is that you needed next to nothing to make this, just cornmeal, rye, and wheat flour, which was already readily available in Massachusetts, government surplus efforts aside. Plus, the best thing about this bread is that it's really dense and sweet thanks to being steamed, and it saves fuel since you don't need to really bake it. In Michigan, something that was already popular became even more of a hill people would die on. Corned beef hash was something that laborers and workers used to have regularly for lunch anyway, but it was a wonderful way to extend the max use you could get out of meat and also make the best out of whatever leftovers you had. All you needed were onions, potatoes, and some scraps of beef if you had any, and voila, you had corned beef hash ready to go. It was a filling meal for a lot of families during that time. Ever heard of lutefisk? Give it a second and try to guess where that comes from. Can't? I wouldn't blame you. It did get a lot of action in Minnesota during the Depression, but lutefisk is actually a dish that comes from traditional Scandinavian cookbooks. It's dry fish treated with some lye, which became the meal of choice for Minnesota's immigrant communities. And I don't mean just the Scandinavian ones. As I mentioned before, a lot of the broader and niche American communities started to adopt tricks from each other to get by. It was just that kind of era. Mississippi had catfish and hush puppies, which residents used to rely on to make their diets a bit more healthier. Plus, even more so than lobster and oysters, catfish was one of the most commonly caught fishes in any stream or body of water across America, but especially in Mississippi. You could pair it with hush puppies, which were just fried cornmeal balls, and it was something that kids would actually enjoy eating as well as adults. Plus, since it took no money as you had to catch your food, it was a solid go-to for a lot of households. A lot of states were just getting by on crackers, and Missouri was one of them. To spice things up and make the dreaded plain cracker breakfast just a touch more exciting, people would add chili or whatever kind of spice and meat was available. Sometimes, if none of that was there, they'd just use beans and tomatoes, throw them on crackers, and call it a day. The part that counted was that this could be made in big batches instead of being a one-time meal for families. It was all about being cost-effective, and that's exactly what chili and crackers were. Montana had to make do with things like shepherd's pie, which was really a popular dish in the state before the Depression anyway. But instead of using ground meat, they would use layers of mashed potatoes and vegetables to make a one-dish meal that could use a minimal amount of ingredients, but still be something that made sure everyone went to bed full and satisfied. Plus, if something could be used later on repeatedly, then families would favor it over all other kinds of dishes. Shepherd's pie made for some pretty good leftovers. Another dish that people started taking from immigrant communities was sausage and sauerkraut. This is also how it spread in general in Nebraska, because it gained a reputation for being a practical, easy-to-store, no-fuss meal that you could make from the simplest of stuff. You just needed fermented cabbage and pork trimmings, and if you didn't have the pork, you didn't need to worry. It was fine with just the cabbage. People would often trade clothes that were on their last legs, patching them up and sewing holes and cuts, and trading them for basic vegetables like cabbages. So this dish got some new love in the state that it didn't have before. Nevada kept it very American with beef jerky and beans. A typical meal for families filled with ranchers who have spent their whole life growing up on lean meat. It was nice to know that they didn't have to abandon that completely and could still enjoy their favorite breakfast. That's a luxury that a lot of people didn't really have during the Depression. Gotta take any win you can get, you know? And pairing that jerky with beans was definitely a win and a meal. People really started to eat food for sustenance rather than for enjoyment, so when they could find both of those things in one meal, it was really a blessing. Maple-baked beans were something that people in New Hampshire really put to use. Maple syrup was really common during the Depression because it worked as a good substitute for sugar, which was becoming more and more expensive. The downside was that you needed to slow cook the beans, which meant that you kind of had to babysit them until they were done just so you wouldn't ruin them, and you definitely couldn't afford to mess up and waste resources back then. Maple-baked beans were a sweet dish that cost little but did a lot of good for many families. One thing about New Jersey is that it was home to a pretty big Italian-American community. They had a lot of dishes that were different from the traditional American food people were used to, like hash browns and bacon and eggs. They used to have stuff like Italian peasant soup, which was made using vegetables and beans, and if possible, a little bit of whatever kind of meat you had available. Vegetables were the same. There was no specific criteria, which is why it gained a reputation for being a staple of rural and lower-class communities. Since we are talking a lot about beans on this list so far, it wouldn't be right not to mention New Mexico. This place was already a hub for that kind of food, and their pinto beans and chili only became more and more of a local favorite as the Depression started to intensify. Chili peppers were really affordable and easy to use in daily cooking, while beans gave your health whatever boost it needed, making it a really simple meal that was nutritious and satisfying. Sometimes, if people really got lucky or could afford to splurge just a bit, they would use green and red chili sauces to make the dishes more spicy. Even in these times, people can't let go of their sweet tooths or their passion for hot food. Speaking of hubs, New York was a melting pot of different cultural backgrounds and communities of immigrants from all over the world back then, too. One of those was the really active Chinese-American community, which had an entire roster of soups fit for the kind of eating that people were adapting during the Depression. Dishes like egg drop soups became close to family heirlooms because of how bare bones they were, requiring almost nothing to make except broth, eggs, and some seasoning, but still being a wonderful dish. Food like this was really necessary because it gave people warmth and comfort that they didn't otherwise have, especially because the ones that did have jobs still had to work for even less money than they were used to. If you go up to the northern side of things, specifically North Carolina, you'll find out that historically the local people there started using cuts of pork that they weren't really using before. Ham hocks got popular because of this. They were really inexpensive, and they made most of these stews and soups better and gave them a nice savory element that they were otherwise lacking. It wasn't just the North. This dish was a staple even in the southern communities. It didn't use a lot of meat, which is what made it a preference, since if you did have pork, you could extend how many meals you could get out of by making food like this. North Dakota was keeping it very minimalistic. People there were pretty much just eating collard greens all of the time. It was something they got from Southern cuisine, typically African American communities which really made use of collard greens wherever they could. It wasn't the most common vegetable, but it was easy to grow and forage. I haven't talked much about this yet, but people also started to get into backyard gardening so that they could grow their own produce and vegetables, and stuff like collard greens were really easy to grow. Also, a lot of these bean dishes and recipes that involved using leftovers were much better off with a side plate of collard greens. Ohio, on the other hand, was really going all in on the simple staple stuff you could find at most grocery stores like Ritz crackers. These crackers were something Ritz came up with in 1934, and they really took off in America and specifically in Ohio. They were marketed as this affordable premium cracker with a strong aftertaste of butter. I mean, that appealed to people anyway, but the extra sales pitch got attention much faster towards these crackers than other items. They even used it as casserole toppings or pie crusts. I get it, to be honest. A good crunch makes any dreadful situation a lot better. This one took me for a bit of a spin when I first heard it, because the concept of a fried onion burger had not ever crossed my mind until I was researching what people ate in Oklahoma during the Depression. Apparently, the patties that they could make out of ground beef were pretty small, and not your average size for a burger at all. It was because they wanted to preserve the meat, you know? So they would stretch it thin and fill the burger in with fried or grilled onions, which gave the burger some much-needed volume. It was a thrifty meal, and it became a regional specialty of the state. Oregon was making use of salmon patties, and that made sense for the time because one of Oregon's biggest industries and sources of income was the fishing industry. One of the most popular and easy-to-catch fishes was salmon. You could make patties out of it, and those would be bigger than the ones you were used to making out of ground beef back then. Top it off with breadcrumbs and eggs, some light seasoning, and you had a pretty good dish that gave you more bang for your buck than other sources of meat you could buy at the time. In Pennsylvania, they had a tradition for scrapple, which was this dish which used pork scraps combined with some cornmeal and warm spices like ginger and cinnamon. Then, you'd fry it, and you were done. There was a massive focus on not letting any part of food go to waste. Not a single stem of a vegetable, not a bit of scraps of pork, nothing at all would be left to waste. People would reuse the grease from bacon to refry things so they wouldn't have to use oil. That's the kind of frugality I'm talking about. Scrapple was a dish that fit that kind of cooking easily, and that's why it got so popular in Pennsylvania, where people often had leftover scraps of meat that they couldn't make proper meals out of. Johnny cakes aren't something you'll ever hear about anymore. They just got pretty irrelevant as the effects of the Depression became a thing of the past, but when it was at its most destructive stages, states like Rhode Island made big use of these Johnny cakes. Why though? It's the same reason we started this list with, and the same ingredient too. Corn was just that available and widespread during the Depression, which is why dishes like this got as much love as they did. It also has a pretty extensive history as a snack in New England, but it became more well-known throughout America thanks to the stock market crash. America had to live off of crops instead of McDonald's for a while, and one of the most readily available crops that you could get in South Carolina was rice. Carolina rice was special because it was kind of sticky, which made it denser and more filling, especially as a kid. Rice with some makeshift gravy was kind of the norm in the state of South Carolina back then. It was extremely easy to make, really affordable, and could be made using broth or meat drippings, which is why it became a staple. It was taken from low country traditions, as most families would already use a lot of rice and gravy in their daily diets, but now they would share their family recipes with whoever was struggling too. This one is something you don't hear about too often. See, people in South Dakota actually got to using a lot of bison meat, and they'd make some pretty amazing buffalo stew out of it. It was a really practical dish in areas where bison could be gamed and hunted easily, and many families relied on taking up arms to hunt for their daily sustenance. People who had never caught or shot anything in their entire lives were suddenly out trying to catch some meat for the family, which meant that the family could thankfully enjoy a larger meal. Plus, bison was great in that it kept you really full for a long time. Corn pone and beans were a Tennessee classic that nobody could really ignore. It was because Tit just used cornbread, which made it insanely economical. I know we've had a lot of corn this, corn that on the list so far, but it really was one of the easiest things you could get in the area. Plus, the beans helped a lot in making it a more fulfilling and satisfying meal because as a standalone, cornbread was good, but it wasn't really able to stand on its own 2 feet. Beans gave it just the bit of support it needed to still feel like a full meal, and a lot of families coasted on this dish, which was readily available in homes across Tennessee. Plus, it was a popular item to bring to communal dinners, which had also had a revival thanks to the Depression. Easier to cook in a community than your own home, people get more food that way, and everyone gets to pile in their resources. Texas took inspiration from Mexican-American culture and communities which made use of corn masa filled with meat and beans that were then wrapped around the husks of corn. I bet you've never had the husk of a corn. Well, at least I know I haven't. But you see what I mean about not letting a single thing go to waste? Families used to make tamales in big batches, and sometimes neighborhoods would gather whatever masa they had and make large pots for the entire block. Since the masa was the main player and not the meat, a lot of people managed to make their meat supplies last longer thanks to dishes like this. In Utah, they were using Mormon scones, which is something that people still do eat regularly there. This dish's claim to fame came from how it needed some really basic pantry ingredients, but Mormon scones back then were different. They substituted baking powder for shortening, or flour for wheat flour, and molasses for sugar. Basically, whatever no-bake version they could find, they'd use it to make Mormon scones, which was a nice sugar rush for families when other options weren't likely. Vermont, on the other hand, was known for its maple syrup. People started to really use it as an alternative to sugar, like we just talked about when we were going over Mormon scones. Maple sugar cookies were made using local maple syrups and were actually a really good and effective way for families to get some sweetness in their diet because they didn't cost much and they were still really easy to make. It was also something parents would keep under their belt for when kids were really cranky and needed something that just tasted good. Speaking of cookies, a lot of people really did live off of biscuits back then too. Virginia, for example, would make use of different toppings and spreads to make the biscuits more flavorful and give them a bit of an edge. Recipes like apple butter and biscuits became super popular because they could elevate biscuits and turn it into somewhat of a humble breakfast. On their own, you could eat an entire box and still not feel full. Given how hungry people were in the Depression, you would get heartburn though. Plus, apples were easy to forage, so this helped the biscuits last a lot longer. Virginia wasn't really the only state where apples were easy to gather and source. Washington also had a major market for apples because it was one of their staple crops. One of the things they used to make out of them were apple dumplings, which were a pretty simple and humble dessert made by wrapping apples in dough and then baking them with some sugar and cinnamon. They were a common treat, and these dumplings used really few ingredients and made the most out of an available fruit. West Virginia had to make do with whatever they could scour. Let me tell you, that wasn't really a lot. They were one of the states that had to face the brunt of the Depression, so as a result they had to resort to pretty much just making do with soup and beans and some cornbread every day. A lot of those soups were really fundamental, just water boiled with beans and some basic seasonings, but for whatever it's worth, it did manage to satiate the hunger, and sometimes water is all you had. Wisconsin was actually one of the few places that got to enjoy dairy. The state always had a penchant for cheese production, and that came in handy when they only had cheese and bread to eat during the day. At least that meant that they could enjoy grilled cheese sandwiches on special days, which is honestly more than most could say. Remember how I talked about people catching and hunting things they weren't really used to? Sometimes it was squirrels and turtles. Sometimes it was rabbits. Like in the case of Wyoming. That state and their reliance on rabbit and biscuits to last them through that sad economic crisis were a big part of why rabbit stew even got popular to begin with. To be fair, as you're probably well aware already after this list, that's still way better off than most of the nation. With that, we wrap up our long list of foods famous in states during the Great Depression. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil. A dash. Depression-era mac and cheese was a budget-friendly comfort food that made you feel like you were living large on a dime. While today's mac and cheese might be full of fancy and expensive cheeses, back in the day, it was all about making the most out of basic ingredients. A boxed pasta, some milk, and only if you were lucky, some cheese. But you better pull that smile off your face. It wasn't the gooey, cheesy kind that we know of today. It was more of a humble, lightly cheesy dish that could fill you up, don't get me wrong. The trick was stretching those precious bits of cheese as far as humanly possible. People would thin it out with milk or even water. And if money was really, really tight, they would use flour to make a roux, a mixture of flour and fat that was used to thicken sauces. It definitely wasn't gourmet, but it was cheap, and the most important of all, it was food. Even with such limited sources, this dish managed to be a crowd pleaser, especially with kids, who were just excited to be eating pasta. Depression-era mac and cheese was a smart way to turn a few simple ingredients into a meal that seemed indulgent, even if it was light years away from today's extravaganza. But you have to admit, sometimes you don't want that fully spiced up mac and cheese. Sometimes you crave a simple canned version that won't make you regret eating it later. And that's exactly what Depression-era mac and cheese achieved. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Corned beef and potato hash was a true Depression-era hero. It was affordable and filling. In a time when fresh meat was hard to come by, corned beef in a can was a lifesaver. Corned beef and potato hash was a shelf-stable, cheap, and stretchy meal. It was a dish that kept bellies full without keeping the wallets empty. The beauty of corned beef hash was in its simplicity. Fry up some chopped potatoes, toss in that canned corned beef, and let it all get crispy in the pan. Adding an onion or two added a bit of spice, but not everyone had that option available. But even if you couldn't afford onions, the combination of corned beef and potatoes was just enough. It was a meal that tasted like you put way more work in than you actually did. It was the kind of meal that could stretch to feed the whole family and still leave enough for leftovers the next day. Corned beef and potato hash wasn't just a Depression-era staple. It was proof that you didn't need fresh ingredients or fancy cooking techniques to make a hearty, filling, and tasty dish on a budget. When times were tough, nothing went to waste, especially not bread. Instead of tossing out stale loaves, deviled eggs with pickles were a treat that turned humble ingredients into something delicious back in the day. Eggs were a cheap, reliable protein source, and if you had a jar of pickles, you were already halfway to creating something fancy, by 1930s standards anyway. Making deviled eggs is nothing revolutionary. Just hard-boil them, scoop out the yolk, and mix with a little mayo, mustard, and the thing that ties it all together: pickles. The pickles added a crunch that took the eggs from plain food to a party snack. However, the only party trick was surviving yet another day on a shoestring budget. People loved deviled eggs because they felt like a special treat, even when times were tough. The pickles added that little something extra, like a surprise flavor bomb in the middle of your egg. Plus, it was a great way to stretch a meal. Eggs were filling, and they were perfect for families who had to make do with limited supplies. Whether served at lunch or as a snack, deviled eggs with pickles were a fun, zesty way to make an ordinary ingredient feel a little more special. Of salt and you were good to go at basically no cost. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Fried corn fritters were a Depression-era favorite because they made something out of almost nothing. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and very versatile, so in times when money was tight, corn fritters were everyone's go-to. All you needed was a little cornmeal, flour, water, or milk, and an egg if you could afford one. Mix it all up, fry it in some oil, and lunch is served. These fritters were the perfect way to turn pastry staples into something delicious. They were crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and packed with flavor. And because cornmeal was so affordable, you could whip up a batch without thinking about how much money it cost. You could even throw in whatever you had in the house to stretch it even more and add nutritional value. Any leftover veggies or cheese added more flavor to the meal, making it even more comforting. Corn fritters were the kind of meal that made you feel resourceful and proved that even in hard times, you could take a handful of basic ingredients and make them into something delicious. Carrot and potato hash was a Depression-era staple that made the most out of two cheap and hearty veggies. Potatoes were filling, while carrots added just enough sweetness to keep things interesting. This meal was perfect for stretching a limited budget because both ingredients were as cheap as they come, lasted forever, and could be found in almost every kitchen. The preparation was simple. Chop up the vegetables, toss them in a hot pan, and fry until golden and crispy. It was simple, but the combination of soft potatoes and slightly caramelized carrots created a comforting, flavorful dish. If you had an onion lying around, it could join the party, adding even more depth to this humble hash. The beauty of carrot and potato hash is in its versatility. You could eat it on its own or throw an egg on top for some protein. Either way, it was filling, warm, and super satisfying. Everything you needed to keep going during tough times. It wasn't the most exciting dish, but it got the job done. And isn't that what really counts? In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though. since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Tomato soup with rice was a Depression-era lunch that combined simplicity with a great deal of comfort. You didn't need much in order to make it. Just a can of tomatoes, or even water and tomato paste, a handful of rice, and any seasoning you like. This was the perfect meal for a cold, rainy day when you needed something warm and filling that could stretch your ingredients and make them last a week. Rice was the main deal here. It could bulk up the soup, turning a thin tomato broth into a hearty meal. With rice, you can always assume that a little goes a long way, and it turned what could have been a sad bowl of red water into a meal that actually felt like food. Plus, rice was very cheap, so adding that to your meals meant you made sure that a small pot of soup could feed the whole family. And while it wasn't really gourmet, you could get your creative freak on and make it special. A few tricks included adding a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity and a pinch of garlic powder to make it zesty. Tomato soup with rice was the kind of meal that will get you through hard times, without making you feel like you were missing out on some great delicacy. It was simple, satisfying, and budget-friendly. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Circling back to soups for a second, let's talk about egg drop soup. This is one of those incredible dishes that somehow manages to be elegant and simple at the same time. It was inspired by Chinese cuisine, and it had become a go-to meal for many families during tough times because it required so few ingredients but still managed to deliver a good amount of nutritional value. All you needed was broth, 1 or 2 eggs, and a bit of green onions. The great thing about egg drop soup is that the preparation doesn't take up much of your time. You heat the broth up and gently whisk in some beaten eggs. Even though eggs seem like the star of the show, the actual star is the broth, since it makes those eggs into something that will keep those bellies happy. Egg drop soup was perfect for families trying to use up any ingredients they had in the house. Whether served as a starter or as a main dish with a side of rice or vegetables, it brought a taste of something new to the table. It was simple, affordable, and downright comforting when comfort was all any of our ancestors were looking for in the era of the Great Depression. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Savory bread pudding with leftover veggies was the ultimate Depression-era hack for turning scraps into a hearty meal. Got stale bread? Perfect. Leftover veggies that are past their prime? Even better. This dish was all about not wasting a thing. People couldn't afford to throw food away during the Great Depression, but instead, they got creative. And this meal was one of those everything but the kitchen sink meals that you might have heard your grandma or great-grandma talking about. To make it, you had to tear up the stale bread, mix it with eggs and milk and whatever leftover vegetables you had lying around. It could be basically anything. Carrots, peas, whatever didn't make the cut for last night's dinner. Season it with salt and pepper and maybe some herb seasoning and bake until it is golden and crispy on top, but soft and warm inside. The best part about savory bread pudding was that it made something delicious out of things you would usually throw away. And the Great Depression didn't look kindly upon those who didn't know how to save up. Stale bread was transformed from slices into a cozy meal that tasted like it took more effort than it actually did. This dish proved that even in hard times, you could make a meal out of practically nothing. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. Onion and potato frittata was an everyday favorite because they turned simple ingredients into a meal that felt special. Potatoes were cheap and filling, and onions added the extra flavor. The beauty of frittata was in its simplicity. You'd slice up some potatoes and onions, fry them until golden, and then pour beaten eggs over the top. Cook it until the eggs are set, and just like that, you had a hearty, savory dish that worked for any meal. It was one of those dishes that could stretch to feed a crowd. Plus, if you had a little cheese lying around, you were going to become a favorite lunch host. It was an easy way to make a meal feel complete without having to use any expensive ingredients. This frittata was super versatile as well. You could throw in whatever veggies or leftovers you had on hand. Whether eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, onion and potato frittata was a reliable go-to that made the most out of limited supplies and left you feeling full and satisfied. It proved that a little creativity could vastly change the food game in the house. Moving on to something sweet for a second, rice pudding with raisins. It was a Depression-era answer to a comforting dessert made from almost nothing. Leftover rice, milk or water, some sugar, and a handful of raisins were all it took to make your kids happy with a sweet treat. The magic happened when the rice simmered down into a creamy, pudding-like consistency, turning something so plain into a dessert that felt a little indulgent. Raisins were the main show here. They added the perfect amount of taste and texture, making it taste fancy rather than ordinary. Just the thought of raisins makes me want to retch. I truly admire the strength our ancestors had when they were able to eat food like this. Don't get me wrong, I love rice pudding, but raisins? No way, not a chance. The best part about rice pudding is how flexible the recipe could be. If you were like me and didn't like raisins, you could just sprinkle some cinnamon on top, or maybe even a splash of vanilla if you were feeling fancy. For families looking to make a warm, sweet, and filling dessert, rice pudding with raisins was the perfect way to go. It satisfied almost every sweet tooth without costing much, making it a household favorite. Plus, it was really simple to make, so even the kids could help and stir the pot. Some of those kids are now our grandparents teaching us those same recipes. How beautiful is that? Dandelion green salad was probably one of the most resourceful dishes to come out of the Great Depression era. The Great Depression was the worst economic downfall in the United States history. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and that marked the beginning of the end for some people. From October 1929 till the end of 1930, America was at a standstill. It's needless to say, people had a hard time putting food on the table while still trying to keep the family members healthy and happy. So, when money was tight and grocery shopping wasn't an option, people had to turn to their own gardens for some free food. You might be thinking to yourself, is there another type of dandelion that I do not know about? And the answer is no, just your regular grow-in-the-park dandelion. What most of us right now consider a park flower or a pesky weed, people considered a nutritious and, even more important, free source of greens back in the day. Dandelions may have a bit of a bitter bite, but you had to work with what nature gave you. So adding some salt and vinegar was a must. And that's all it took to turn these lawn invaders into a Great Depression-era salad. Families would head out with baskets and pick out an enormous amount of dandelions. So, with no grocery list and no checkout lines, people went out and got their ingredients. But hey, not only did they stretch the food budget, but they also kept their lawns clean and fresh. Talk about multitasking. Moving on to something more concrete, Johnny cakes. They could be whatever your heart desired. A main dish, a side dish, something sweet or something salty. They were true soldiers during the tough times. These cornmeal-based pancakes were a lifesaver for families looking to stretch their budgets. With just a few basic ingredients, cornmeal, water, and maybe a dash of salt if you were feeling fancy, you could whip up a batch of Johnny cakes that kept everyone fed without having to pull a bank job. Bread was often too expensive or hard to come by. Johnny cakes were the affordable alternative that could be made from cornmeal, which was widely available and cheap. These little golden cakes were versatile too. You could eat them plain, or drizzled with syrup if you were lucky to have it lying around the house. Johnny cakes were filling and could hold their own as the main course or side dish. Some people might say that they were a bit bland, but what did you expect? A gourmet meal in those times? Johnny cakes were the epitome of resourcefulness. Just cornmeal and water mixed together and fried up on a hot griddle. Simple? Yes. But when you're trying to make every penny count, Johnny cakes got the job done and kept hunger away. Mock apple pie is another delicious dessert that clicked with masses across the nations during rough times. As apples were getting expensive, people were looking for cheaper alternatives. That is when the mock apple pie entered. Resemblance is one thing, but if the pie looks and tastes like it, then it might as well be an apple pie. Created using cheap and the nation-favorite Ritz crackers, mixing those with some vanilla syrup, sprinkle some lemon and cinnamon to create a perfect home-baked pie fit to rival apple pie. The Depression era onwards really saw an explosion in its popularity. We cannot really blame people either. Fresh, juicy apples were in hot demand and short supply. The pie was just as cheap as Hoover stew and easy to make. Nowadays, of course, you would not find this in houses you go to, despite it being popular enough that Ritz had instructions on the back of the box on how to make it. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. Spaghetti with garlic and olive oil was a Depression-era meal that proved you could make something delicious from only 3 ingredients: spaghetti, garlic, and olive oil. You could whip up a dish that felt fancy without emptying your wallet. This was the kind of meal that made you look like you knew what you were doing in the kitchen, even when you were just throwing stuff together. Boil the spaghetti, then toss it in a pan with sizzling garlic and olive oil, and in a matter of seconds, your home smelled like an Italian restaurant. Sure, you didn't have any meat or sauce, but who needs them when you have garlic to do all the heavy lifting? Olive oil gave the pasta a nice, silky coat, while the garlic brought the savory punch that made you forget how simple the dish actually was. If you had the means, you would sprinkle some Parmesan or red pepper flakes on top, but even without these extras, the pasta hit the spot. This dish was a Depression-era go-to because it was cheap, easy, and quick to make. And sometimes, less is more. Then came the cornmeal mush, joining pies and stews on the list of economically sensible lunches. When times are tough, porridges become a very enticing meal, as affording bacon strips or other meats for breakfast was out of the question. Even if you got cheap beef jerky, you did not know if it was good and clean meat, and typical American breakfasts like grilled bacon and eggs were losing popularity due to price constraints. People needed their 7 a.m. nutrition, so cornmeal mush, an incredibly healthy dish, became popular. Topping the cornmeal with maple syrup, or in some cases a thick sausage gravy, elevated it in the taste department. It was not much of a fan favorite though, because the mush did not last long after the economy settled. Once people could afford better, they definitely went back to their regulars. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. While we're on the topic of sweets, let's talk about baked apples with cinnamon. They were the ultimate Depression-era dessert, which could turn just a few apples into something that felt warm and comforting. Apples were relatively inexpensive and easy to come by, and baking them with a sprinkle of cinnamon transformed them into a dessert that made everyone feel like they were indulging. Making baked apples was as simple as coring the apples, placing them in a dish, and stuffing the centers with a mix of cinnamon, sugar, and maybe a little butter if you had some. And into the oven they'd go. In a matter of minutes, your house smelled like a bakery from dreams. The apples would soften. Their natural sweetness was enhanced by the cinnamon, and the result was a dish that felt way more luxurious than it actually was. This was a dessert that required very few ingredients, but the payoff was huge. It was warm and delicious, and made you feel like you were eating something truly special, even in the middle of hard times. Whether served on their own or with a bit of cream if you had it, baked apples with cinnamon were a simple pleasure that lifted spirits without draining the pantry. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular, as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Fried rice with vegetables was the ultimate Depression-era hack for making leftovers exciting again. Day-old rice was the perfect base because it was cheap, filling, and easy to stretch. And just like with rice pudding with raisins, rice came to steal the show. You'd take whatever vegetables were on hand, carrots, peas, onions, or anything nearing its expiration date, Toss them in a hot pan with a bit of oil and fry it all together until golden and fragrant. Nothing, and I mean nothing, goes to waste. This dish was about making the most of what you had. It didn't matter if the veggies were a little past their prime because once they hit the pan, they were given a new life. A little soy sauce or garlic added a ton of flavor, and if you were lucky enough to have an egg, you could crack one in for extra protein. The fried rice was a genius way to turn scraps into something satisfying. It was fast, flavorful, and filling, everything you needed in a meal when times were tough. Plus, it was incredibly versatile. You could throw in any leftover meat or keep it vegetarian, and it would still be a hearty dish that stretched the food budget. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Did you catch food we missed in your states? If so, comment the food below and don't forget to like and subscribe.